It started with a single message. A few words typed in the quiet of midnight, meant for no one but a friend she trusted. But in a world where screenshots live longer than truth, that message found its way to eyes it was never meant to meet. By sunrise, whispers had turned to shouts, and her phone wouldn't stop lighting up. Each notification was another spark in a digital wildfire. The walls of her room seemed to shrink as the world outside expanded, full of voices she didn't know, but that somehow knew her name. It's strange how fast kindness fades when a secret leaks, how silence becomes a storm. And as the comments grew crueler, one question burned in her chest. What if one mistake was enough to erase everything you are? By the time she reached school, everyone had seen it. Conversations paused when she walked by. Laughter dropped to whispers. The message had turned her into a villain, someone to mock, someone to destroy. She didn't know how something so small had grown so big. Her chest tightened as eyes followed her. She wanted to speak, but the words refused to leave her throat. It felt like being buried alive under glances, under judgment, under a truth she didn't recognize. Each word they said behind her back echoed louder than the truth itself. The message wasn't cruel, but twisted screenshots had painted her as something she wasn't. Every step down the hall felt heavier, every sound sharper. She started counting her breaths just to keep steady. The internet's voice had followed her into real life. Now, it had 1,000 faces. That night, she deleted all her accounts. But the internet never forgets. Her name still trended locally. Her face still appeared in memes. She felt small, trapped between screens and silence. Yet deep inside, a question lingered. Why do people love tearing others apart? Was it power? Or just fear disguised as laughter? Before she fell asleep, she whispered an apology to no one. She didn't know who deserved it. Herself, her friend, or the world that turned so cruel. But in the quiet after the chaos, she understood one thing. The internet has no mercy, and truth has no voice when lies travel faster. Morning light spilled across her desk as she scrolled through headlines she never asked for. Every notification felt like a heartbeat she couldn't calm. The noise outside her window sounded distant, as if the world had turned its back. For a moment she thought about replying, explaining, fighting back. But then she remembered her teacher's words. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the start of clarity. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and whispered to herself that she was still here. The counselor's room smelled of coffee and paper. She spoke slowly, as if each word might break if pushed too hard. It wasn't about the message anymore. It was about learning how quickly truth can blur online. She realized that what people believe isn't always what happened, and that her strength depended on how she carried the silence inside her. By lunchtime, she felt the air around her change, still cautious but less sharp. A few classmates offered quiet nods, and one even asked if she was okay. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. She looked at them and understood that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the choice to walk into a place that once terrified you and simply breathe. Later that afternoon, she found herself sitting beneath the oak tree, where she used to sketch after class. The wind felt different now, gentle, almost forgiving. She looked at her phone, its screen blank, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel afraid of it. The world inside that device had twisted her words, but out here, surrounded by real air and rustling leaves, she remembered who she was. Sometimes the only way to quiet the noise is to step outside. When she finally looked up, he was there. No apology, just an honest silence that said everything. He handed her the sketchbook, and their eyes met. Two people who had seen how quickly the world could turn cruel, now learning how to be kind again. In that quiet exchange, forgiveness began, not with words, but with understanding. She realized healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about letting the light back in. Days passed like echoes. She still felt the weight of what had happened, but something inside her had changed. The silence that once felt like punishment now felt like space. Space to breathe, to think, to heal. She started writing again, not for anyone to see, but for herself. Every word became a step away from the fear that once controlled her. And though the memory still hurt, she was learning that pain can be a teacher, too. Across town, someone else was also struggling with silence. Regret doesn't arrive loudly. It comes in quiet hours when no one's watching. She read the message again, realizing how much damage a single action had caused. For the first time, she saw the difference between being right and being kind. And in that realization, she felt the first sting of guilt turn into a need to make things right. When they met again after class, no one spoke at first. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. She looked at him, her oldest friend, and saw the apology in his eyes before he said a word. They both knew that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It only makes room for tomorrow. And in that quiet moment, something fragile but real began to grow between them again. Trust. The afternoon sky carried a softness she hadn't noticed in weeks. Maybe the world hadn't changed. Maybe it was her. She began to see that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what happened. It was about freeing herself from the pain that held her down. Her voice, once trapped in fear, began to find rhythm again. She decided to tell her story, not to clear her name, but to help someone else who might feel the same kind of silence. When she finished speaking, the room was silent, not with judgment, but with understanding. For the first time, she felt seen. Not through a screen, but through human eyes that carried empathy. Emily stood up slowly, her voice shaking as she said the only words that mattered. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was honest. And that honesty became the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild what was lost." The afternoon sun poured through the library windows, painting quiet patterns across the floor. It had taken her days to gather the courage to speak again. Not to defend herself, but to understand what went wrong. She knew the truth wouldn't change the past, but it could still guide what came next. Facing someone who once hurt you isn't about anger. It's about reclaiming peace. And as she waited, she felt calm for the first time in a long while. When she arrived, there was no script, no plan, just two people trying to find the courage to be honest. The words came slowly at first, pauses, small breaths, half smiles that carried guilt and hope all at once. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't saying sorry, but believing that you deserve to be forgiven. As they talked, the truth began to unfold, not in anger, but in understanding. She finally saw how quickly judgment had spread, how fear had clouded reason, and Sarah realized something too. Pain shared with empathy loses its sharpness. They couldn't undo what was done, but they could learn from it. In that quiet corner, surrounded by books and fading sunlight, they promised to be better. Not perfect, just better. The next day, they met again. Not to revisit mistakes, but to decide what to do with what they'd learned. The idea came quietly. To turn their experience into a story that might help someone else. It wasn't about erasing guilt. It was about creating purpose from pain. For the first time, they were on the same side, writing together instead of against each other. When their small video finally played in class, a story about empathy, mistakes, and second chances, the room fell silent. Not from pity, but from recognition. Everyone had seen a little of themselves in it. She watched faces soften, shoulders relax, and for the first time she felt the power of truth shared with compassion. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what they could build from it. After everything, the world finally felt still. There were no messages to chase, no rumors to correct. Just the quiet rhythm of ordinary days returned. She learned that peace doesn't come when people forget what happened. It comes when you stop letting it define you. The The silence that once felt heavy now sounded like freedom. In art class, she opened a blank page. For a moment she stared, unsure what to draw. Then the pencil moved on its own, tracing something simple. A sunrise. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The picture wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about starting again with softer colors. Sometimes silence teaches more than words. They no longer needed to talk about what happened every day. Instead, they shared small gestures, passing notes about assignments, laughing softly at inside jokes, helping with projects. It was an ordinary piece, but to them, it felt sacred. On a quiet evening, she sat by her window again. The same sky, the same city, but everything felt new. The silence no longer echoed with pain. It hummed with gratitude. She thought about everyone who had stood by her, even when it was hard. In the distance, she heard laughter, and for once, it didn't hurt. Before she went to sleep, she whispered a quiet, "Thank you." To life, to growth, to second chances. The world hadn't forgotten what happened, but it no longer controlled her story. She realized silence can heal when it's filled with meaning. And sometimes, peace doesn't need to be loud to be real. Weeks later, the auditorium lights glowed against a quiet crowd. She stood behind the microphone, hands trembling but heart steady. She wasn't here to relive the past. She was here to show that moving forward was possible. The words she once hid now carried light. Every sentence she spoke was a promise that the noise of the world would never again drown her voice. She spoke about fear, about forgiveness, about the quiet work of starting again. Every face watching her seemed softer, every breath slower. The same network that once hurt her had now become a bridge. Her story was traveling not as rumor, but as truth. And in that moment, she realized courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to speak anyway. After the talk, people she barely knew came to thank her. Some shared their own stories. Some just smiled in silence. It wasn't about being strong for them. It was about reminding them that no one has to be alone in the noise. Later, they sat together on the school steps, watching the sky fade into evening. The past no longer felt heavy. It felt distant, like a lesson learned. They talked about creating a small group, somewhere students could share safely without fear. Healing had given them purpose, and purpose gave them hope. That night, she wrote one last entry in her notebook. Maybe the internet isn't the problem. Maybe it's how we choose to use it. She smiled at the thought that tomorrow might bring another voice, another story, another beginning. The same platform that once broke her had now become her canvas. Months later, the world felt softer. She had learned that healing doesn't erase the past, it simply teaches you to carry it differently. The noise that once filled her life was gone, replaced by small, ordinary sounds. Laughter, pages turning, her own breathing. She looked back only to remind herself how far she'd come. In the library, she reread the notes she once kept hidden. They didn't hurt anymore. They felt like reminders of strength. Every scar told a story of survival, every page proof that silence can grow into wisdom. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the hardest chapters lead to the best ones. That evening, their new online group began to grow. Dozens of students shared stories, some of pain, some of hope. Reading them, she realized she wasn't alone. None of them were. The internet hadn't changed, but they had. They were learning to build light where shadows used to live. Rains used to live. Later, walking home beneath a sky full of stars, she felt gratitude more than anything else. She knew she couldn't control what people said, but she could control how she responded. Kindness wasn't weakness. It was strength learned the hard way. The night air carried a quiet peace that made her believe in tomorrow. Back in her room, she wrote one final line. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over pain. She placed her pen down and smiled. The story that once broke her had become her strength. And as she turned off the light, her last thought was simple yet powerful. How loud can silence be when it's filled with love?